Before the Gospels, before the Apostles, there was an era of bold prophets, men and women who claimed to speak in the name of God. Their words not only foretold the future, but often did so through methods that today would seem shocking, puzzling, and even bizarre. Imagine a man commanded to marry a prostitute as a divine message, another forced to lie motionless for over a year, bearing the sins of a nation. Visions of bones coming back to life, talking animals rebuking seers, and messages of judgment written by ghostly hands on palace walls. The Old Testament is a treasure of wisdom, but also a chest full of deep mysteries. Today we will not focus on the best-known predictions, but rather uncover the strangest and most disturbing prophecies and prophetic acts, the ones that will make you see these ancient seers and their messages in a completely new light. Prepare yourself for a journey into the most unusual corners of biblical prophecy. Let's begin. Chat in Ezekiel lying on his side. Imagine a man, a prophet named Ezekiel, living among the exiles of Judah in Babylon around the 6th century BC. God gives him a series of incredibly strange and physically demanding instructions to represent the imminent siege and fall of Jerusalem. This is not a simple spoken prophecy. It is a prophetic performance that lasts over a year. In chapter 4 of the book of Ezekiel, God first commands him to take a clay brick and draw a sketch of the city of Jerusalem on it. Then he is to simulate a siege against that brick, building miniature ramps and battering rams. But the strangest part involves his own body. God says to him, "Lie on your left side and lay the sin of the house of Israel upon yourself. For the number of days you lie on your side, you will bear their guilt." And he assigns him 390 days on his left side, representing the years of Israel's sin. But that's not all. The book of Ezekiel continues. "After you have finished this, lie down again, this time on your right side, and bear the sin of the house of Judah for 40 days. I have assigned you 1 day for each year." So after lying on one side for over a year, he was to switch to the other for another 40 days. To ensure he wouldn't move, God tells him symbolically, "I will tie you with ropes so that you cannot turn from one side to the other until you have completed the days of your siege." This prophetic act is strange for several reasons. First, the prolonged immobility and physical discomfort Ezekiel had to endure are extreme. Imagine the toll on his health and daily life. Second, the idea of symbolically bearing a nation's sins in such a literal and visual way is striking. Each day he lay there was a silent, persistent reminder of the length and weight of the people's unfaithfulness. Scholars interpret this action as a vivid dramatization of God's patience reaching its limit and the inevitability of judgment. The 390 and 40 days, or years, have been much debated regarding their exact calculation and the historical periods they refer to, but the overall message is clear. The coming punishment would be proportionate to the persistence of sin. Through his own body, Ezekiel became a living sign, a kind of human hourglass counting down to Jerusalem's day of reckoning. It is an extreme example of how prophets were sometimes called to embody their message in deeply personal and unusual ways. 9. Isaiah walking naked and barefoot. Now, imagine another of Israel's great prophets, Isaiah, who lived in the 8th century BC, a time of intense political turmoil and military threats from powers like Assyria. In the midst of this tense environment, God asked Isaiah to carry out a public act. that today we would consider extremely shocking and strange, all to deliver a very specific message. In chapter 20 of the book of Isaiah, we are told that God said to Isaiah, "Go, remove the sackcloth from your body and take off your sandals." Sackcloth was a rough garment, often worn as a sign of mourning or penitence, but it could also be the typical outer garment of a prophet. Isaiah obeyed, and the text says he walked around naked and barefoot. It's important to clarify that naked in this context likely did not mean completely unclothed, but rather stripped of his outer garments, possibly wearing only a short inner tunic or a loincloth, which in that culture was already a sign of deep humiliation and vulnerability. What's most extraordinary is that Isaiah had to remain in this state for 3 long years. Verse 3 says, "Then the Lord said, just as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign and portent against Egypt and Cush." The purpose of this prolonged and highly visible act was to serve as a living sign, a prophetic warning of what would happen to Egypt and Cush, another name for Ethiopia, nations in whom some in Judah were placing their trust for protection against Assyria. The prophecy continued by explaining that just as Isaiah walked exposed and humiliated, so too would the king of Assyria carry away the Egyptians and the Ethiopians as captives, young and old, naked and barefoot, with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. The message was clear. Do not rely on foreign powers, for they themselves will be humiliated and defeated. This prophetic act is both strange and powerful for several reasons. Isaiah's public exposure for such an extended time must have been incredibly difficult, subjecting him to ridicule, scorn, and the harshness of the elements. It was a raw and visual way to communicate the shame and helplessness that Judah's allies would experience. Scholars note that these prophetic signs or symbolic acts were common among Hebrew prophets, but Isaiah's stands out because of its duration and its profoundly exposed nature. It was a far more impactful form of communication than mere words, designed to shake the people from their complacency and force them to confront the harsh reality of their false securities. 8. Hosea marrying a prostitute. There was a prophet named Hosea who ministered in the northern kingdom of Israel during the 8th century BC, a time of great moral and spiritual decline marked by idolatry and injustice. To illustrate in the most personal and painful way the broken relationship between God and Israel, God gave Hosea a command that defied all social and moral conventions. In chapter 1 of the book of Hosea, the text begins with a shocking declaration. "The word of the Lord that came to Hosea. The Lord said to Hosea, Go, take for yourself a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, for the land commits great harlotry by forsaking the Lord." Thus, Hosea receives the divine command to marry a woman named Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, who is described as a prostitute or a woman inclined to unfaithfulness. Hosea obeys and marries Gomer. They have children, and the names God tells Hosea to give them are also prophetic and full of judgment. Jezreel, meaning God sows, but also evoking a bloody massacre. Lo Ruhamah, not pitied or not loved, and Lo Ami, not my people. These names symbolized God's rejection of Israel's unfaithfulness and the breaking of the covenant relationship. As expected, Gomer is not faithful to Hosea. Chapter 3 of Hosea tells how, after abandoning him and chasing other lovers, possibly falling into slavery or desperate conditions, God gives Hosea an even stranger and more moving second command. Go again, love a woman who is loved by a lover and is an adulteress, just as the Lord loves the children of Israel, who turn to other gods and love raisin cakes. Hosea must then buy Gomer back redeem her from her condition, and bring her home, keeping her separate for a time before restoring the marriage relationship. This prophetic act is profoundly strange and personally painful for Hosea. His marriage and family life become a living parable of the relationship between God and Israel. Gomer's infidelity reflects Israel's idolatry and betrayal of God, who had been like a faithful husband to them. Hosea's pain and humiliation mirror the sorrow of God. But crucially, Hosea's unwavering and unconditional love for Gomer, despite everything, and his willingness to redeem her, symbolize God's unending love for his people, his longing for their return, and his promise of restoration despite their continual sin. Scholars highlight the boldness of this metaphor. Portraying God as a betrayed husband and his people as an unfaithful wife was an incredibly powerful and emotional way to convey the depth of covenant relationship and the seriousness of Israel's sin. Hosea's life became the message, a living testimony of both divine judgment and God's astonishing, unbreakable mercy. Seven, Ezekiel's vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. It happened that the prophet Ezekiel, who, as we've already seen, experienced some very strange things, was taken by the Spirit of God and placed in the middle of a valley. But this was no ordinary valley. Ezekiel chapter 37 tells us that this valley was full of bones, and not just a few bones, there were countless bones completely dry, as if they had been there for an eternity. God asks Ezekiel, "Son of man, can these bones live?" A difficult question, right? Ezekiel, with caution, replies, "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." Then God gives him a surprising command. Prophesy to these bones and say to them, "Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord." Ezekiel was to declare that God would breathe spirit into them, attach tendons, flesh, and skin, and they would live again. As Ezekiel prophesied, something incredible happened. There was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones began to come together, bone to its matching bone. Then tendons appeared on them, flesh grew, and skin covered them. But they still had no breath. Then God told Ezekiel to prophesy to the Spirit, to the breath of life, so that it would enter them. And when he did, the breath came into the bodies, and the text says they came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. This vision is strange because of how graphic, and at first even macabre, it is. A valley full of death suddenly coming back to life in such vivid detail. But what did it all mean? God himself explains it to Ezekiel. These dry bones represented the whole house of Israel in exile, who felt hopeless, as if their nation were dead and gone. They said, "Our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone. We are completely cut off." So this strange vision was actually a powerful message of hope and restoration. God was showing Ezekiel and the entire exiled people that he had the power to bring life back to what seemed hopelessly dead. It wasn't just about individual physical resurrection, but the spiritual and national restoration of Israel, that they would return to their land and be revived as a people. It remains one of the most vivid and remembered prophecies, a symbol of God's power to turn the deepest despair into new life and a new beginning. 6. Zechariah's vision of the woman in a basket. Now imagine the prophet Zechariah. He lived after the Babylonian exile, when some Jews had returned to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Zechariah had a series of very strange night visions, and one of the strangest is found in chapter 5 of his book. Zechariah tells us that he looked up and saw something that looked like a large basket, the kind used to measure grain, called an ephah. This basket had a heavy lead cover. When the cover was lifted, Zechariah saw a woman sitting inside the basket. An angel who spoke with him explained, "This is wickedness." In other words, the woman in the basket represented the sin and wickedness of the people. Then the angel pushed the woman back into the basket and closed the heavy lead lid over her, thus sealing away wickedness. And then the vision got even stranger. Zechariah saw two women coming forth, flying. They had wings like a stork, and the wind was beneath their wings. These two winged women lifted the basket, with wickedness inside, and carried it between heaven and earth. Zechariah, just as astonished as any of us would be, asked the angel, "Where are they taking the basket?" The angel replied that they were taking it to the land of Shinar, which is Babylon, to build a house for it. And once the house was ready, they would set the basket there, in its designated place. This vision is truly strange because of all the images it uses. A woman who represents wickedness, locked in a basket, sealed with lead, and then carried away by two winged beings to Babylon. But what did it all mean? Scholars explain that this vision was a symbolic message for the people who were rebuilding their lives and the temple in Jerusalem. It represented the purification of the land of Israel from sin and idolatry. Wickedness being sealed up and taken far away, specifically to Babylon, a place that for Jews symbolized pagan oppression and corruption, meant that God was cleansing his community. It was a way of saying that sin would no longer have a permanent place among them, as long as they remained faithful. The women with stork-like wings, a bird that in some cultures is associated with goodness, though here they simply serve as divine transporters, take wickedness to its own place, meaning out of the Holy Land. It's a very vivid and slightly bizarre way to depict the idea of sanctification and the removal of sin. 5. Daniel's vision of the four beasts. Let us now turn to one of the most famous and certainly most terrifying prophetic visions in the Old Testament. This vision was received by the prophet Daniel, who served in the courts of foreign kings during the Jewish exile in Babylon. In chapter 7 of the book of Daniel, he recounts a dream that left him deeply disturbed. Daniel saw in his night vision that the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and out of the sea came four enormous beasts, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, but had the wings of an eagle. As Daniel watched, its wings were torn off, it was lifted from the ground and stood on 2 feet like a man, and it was given the heart of a man. Then a second beast appeared, resembling a bear. It was raised up on one side more than the other, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, "Arise, devour much flesh." Next, Daniel saw another beast like a leopard, but it had 4 wings of a bird on its back. This beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. But the fourth beast was the most terrifying of all. The text says it was dreadful and terrible and exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth, it devoured and crushed, and whatever was left, it trampled underfoot. It was different from all the beasts before it, and had 10 horns. As Daniel watched the horns, he saw another little horn grow up among them, which uprooted 3 of the original horns. This little horn had eyes like those of a man and a mouth that spoke boastfully. This sequence of strange and monstrous beasts is a key feature of what is known as apocalyptic literature, which uses powerful symbols to reveal divine truths about God's sovereignty and the course of history. But what did these creatures mean? A heavenly being explained it to Daniel. These 4 great beasts are 4 kingdoms or empires that will rise on the earth. Scholars generally interpret these beasts as a succession of empires that dominated the ancient world and impacted the people of Israel. The winged lion represents Babylon, the bear, the Medo-Persian Empire, the 4-headed leopard, the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great, which was divided among his 4 generals, and the terrifying 4th beast, the Roman Empire. The little horn that emerges afterward has been interpreted in various ways, often as a figure of an antichrist or an oppressive power. The most important part of this vision, beyond identifying each beast with a specific empire, is its central message. Though earthly powers may seem invincible and terrifying, God holds ultimate authority over history. The vision culminates with the image of the Ancient of Days, that is God seated on his throne, and one like a son of man, a Messianic figure, who is given eternal dominion. Thus, this strange, monster-filled prophecy was ultimately meant to give hope to God's people. assuring them that God's kingdom will triumph over all earthly empires. The writing on the wall. Prepare yourself for a scene that feels pulled straight from a horror film, yet it lies at the very heart of the Old Testament. It is told in chapter 5 of the book of Daniel. We are in Babylon during the reign of Belshazzar, who is believed to have been co-regent with his father Nabonidus, the last king of the Babylonian Empire. Belshazzar is hosting a lavish banquet for 1,000 of his nobles. There is wine, music, and much celebration. In the midst of the party, perhaps emboldened by the effects of alcohol, Belshazzar has a terrible idea. He commands that the sacred gold and silver vessels, which his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar had looted from the temple in Jerusalem, be brought in. The king, along with his nobles, wives, and concubines, begins drinking wine from these consecrated vessels while praising their own gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, a blatant act of desecration and arrogance. Then at the climax of this sacrilegious feast, the unthinkable happens. The text says, "At that very hour, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace." The king watched the hand as it wrote. Imagine the terror. A disembodied hand floating in the air, writing a mysterious message on the palace wall for all to see. King Belshazzar turns pale with fear. His knees begin to shake and he can barely stand. Desperate, he cries out for the wise men, astrologers, and diviners of Babylon, promising great rewards to anyone who can read and interpret the writing. But none of the kingdom's wise men can decipher the message. Finally, the Queen Mother remembers Daniel, a Jewish exile who had served Nebuchadnezzar and had proven to have an extraordinary spirit and the ability to interpret dreams and riddles. Daniel is brought before the king. After rebuking Belshazzar for his arrogance and for failing to learn from the humility God had imposed upon Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel reads and interprets the words written in Aramaic, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Daniel explains their meaning. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, singular form of Upharsin. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. It was a divine judgment, direct, final, and inescapable. And the most chilling part is that very night, just as Daniel had prophesied, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was killed, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom. This story is both strange and powerful because of its direct and personal supernatural manifestation. A hand of God, or an angel, interrupting a party to deliver a death sentence. It is a forceful reminder that arrogance and desecration do not go unnoticed by God, and that his judgment can arrive suddenly and decisively. Three, Balaam's donkey speaks. This is one of those biblical stories that, if it weren't in Scripture, you might think was a fantasy tale. We turn now to the book of Numbers, chapter 22, at a time when the Israelites, having left Egypt, were camped near the land of Moab. Balak, the king of Moab, was terrified of the Israelites and sought a way to weaken them. So he sent for a well-known seer or prophet from Mesopotamia named Balaam, offering him great riches if he would come and curse Israel. After some back and forth with Balak's messengers and with God, who initially told Balaam not to go but later permitted him to go under certain conditions, Balaam finally set out on the journey, riding his donkey accompanied by 2 servants. And here's where the story gets truly strange. The text tells us that God's anger burned because he went. So as Balaam rode along, the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him with a drawn sword in hand. The curious part is that Balaam did not see the angel, but his donkey did. Seeing the angel, the donkey veered off the road into a field. Balaam, unaware of the reason, struck the donkey to force her back onto the path. A little further along, the angel stood in a narrow path between vineyards with a wall on either side. Again, The donkey saw the angel and pressed against one of the walls, crushing Balaam's foot. Enraged, Balaam struck her again. Then for a third time the angel moved ahead and stood in a place so narrow there was no room to turn. Upon seeing the angel, the donkey simply lay down under Balaam. Balaam's anger burned even hotter, and he struck the donkey with his staff. And then the incredible happened. Numbers 22:28 says, "Then the Lord opened the donkey's mouth, and she said to Balaam, 'What have I done to you, that you have beaten me these 3 times?' The donkey spoke, and not only did she speak, she carried on a coherent conversation with Balaam. Rather than being astonished that his donkey was talking, Balaam angrily replied that if he had a sword he would have killed her. The donkey responded, 'Am I not your donkey, which you have ridden all your life? Have I ever behaved this way before?' And Balaam had to admit she had not. At that moment, God opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel standing there with his sword drawn. Balaam bowed low and fell face down. The angel rebuked him for striking his donkey, explaining that she had saved his life 3 times, because if she had not turned aside, the angel would have killed Balaam and let the donkey live. This story is strange primarily because of the miracle of a talking animal. It's a unique event in the Bible. Scholars view it as a powerful divine irony. A famous prophet, supposedly gifted with spiritual sight, is blind to the presence of an angel, while his simple donkey sees it clearly. The animal shows more spiritual discernment than the seer. It is God's way of humbling Balaam, who was tempted by greed, and showing him that God controls all things, even the mouth of a donkey, to fulfill his purposes and protect his people, Israel, from being cursed. Two, Jeremiah's rotten linen belt. Now we come to the prophet Jeremiah, often referred to as the weeping prophet, because of the heavy messages of judgment he had to deliver to the kingdom of Judah before its fall to Babylon in the 6th century BC. Like other prophets, Jeremiah was also called to perform very strange symbolic acts to illustrate divine messages. One such act is the story of the linen belt, found in chapter 13 of the book of Jeremiah. God gave Jeremiah a very specific instruction. Go and buy yourself a linen belt and put it around your waist, but do not put it in water. A linen belt was an undergarment worn close to the body, symbolizing intimacy and closeness. Jeremiah obeyed and bought the belt. Then God gave him a second command. Take the belt you bought and are wearing, get up and go to the Euphrates, and hide it there in a crevice in the rock. The Euphrates River was far from Jerusalem, deep in the heart of the Babylonian Empire, the very enemy threatening Judah. The journey itself was already a considerable task, but Jeremiah obeyed and hid the belt as he was instructed. After many days, God spoke to Jeremiah again. Go now to the Euphrates and retrieve the belt I commanded you to hide there. Jeremiah went, dug up the belt from where he had buried it, and the result was that the belt was ruined and completely useless. It had rotted and become worthless. This act, which may seem like a bizarre and pointless errand, had a very deep symbolism that God himself explained to Jeremiah. Just as a linen belt clings tightly to the waist of a man, so had God caused all of Israel and Judah to cling to him, to be his people, his renown, his praise, and his glory. But they did not listen. Therefore, the rotting of the belt symbolized the corrupt state of the people of Judah, brought on by their pride, idolatry, and disobedience. Just as the belt had become useless, so would God make the pride of Judah and the great pride of Jerusalem rot away. The fact that the belt was hidden near the Euphrates was also a sign. The people would be taken into exile in that distant land, where their pride would be broken. This prophetic act is unusual for its elaborate nature and the striking symbolism of deterioration. It was not merely a spoken word, but a visual and tactile experience of how something that was once close to God, something valuable, could be corrupted and lose all its purpose due to sin. It is a very vivid lesson about lost intimacy and the consequences of drifting away from God. 1. Ezekiel baking bread over human dung. We return now to the prophet Ezekiel, who, as we've already seen, was called to perform some of the strangest and most difficult symbolic acts in the Old Testament. Immediately following the command to lie on his side for over a year, found in Ezekiel chapter 4, God gives him detailed instructions about his diet during that time, and how he is to cook his bread in a way that is particularly shocking. God tells Ezekiel to take various kinds of grains and legumes, wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt, place them in a vessel and make bread from them. He was to eat this bread during the 390 days he lay on his left side. The amount of food was also strictly rationed, only 20 shekels per day, about 230 grams, along with a measured amount of water, 1/6 of a hin, a little over half a liter. This already symbolized the scarcity and hunger that would come during the siege of Jerusalem. But the most disturbing part concerns the fuel to cook that bread. God commands him, "You shall bake it in their sight using human dung as fuel." Yes, you heard that right. He was to use dried human excrement as the fire to bake his bread in front of everyone. This was to symbolize the deep defilement and unclean state that the people of Israel would suffer. God himself explains, "So shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the nations where I will drive them." Faced with such a disturbing command, Ezekiel, who was a priest and therefore deeply aware of the laws of ritual purity, becomes anguished and protests. He says to God, "Ah, Lord God, indeed I have never defiled myself. From my youth till now I have never eaten what died of itself or was torn by beasts, nor has abominable flesh ever come into my mouth." This is a desperate plea from someone asked to do something that went against everything he held sacred. Thankfully, in this case, God shows a measure of compassion toward his prophet. He responds, "See, I give you cow dung instead of human dung, and you shall prepare your bread over it." Though cow dung was still considered a poor and humiliating fuel, it was far less repulsive and ritually unclean than human waste. This prophetic act is strange and deeply disturbing for the rawness of the image it conveys. It represented, in the most visceral way, the desperation, extreme scarcity, and defilement the people would endure during the siege and exile. They would eat defiled bread, not only because the food would be poor in quality and quantity, but because they would be in pagan lands, far from the purity laws of the temple. This is an extreme example of how God used Ezekiel to communicate, in the most graphic way possible, the terrible consequences of sin and disobedience. And so we conclude our journey through 10 of the strangest and most bewildering prophecies of the Old Testament. From extreme physical acts to visions that defy the imagination, these prophets show us that the divine message is sometimes delivered in ways that shake us and force us to think beyond the conventional. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of biblical mysteries. If you want to continue diving into these enigmas and fascinating accounts, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Right now, 2 videos are appearing on screen that I've handpicked especially for you. Just click on one to keep learning. May God bless you. Amen.